Morning, everybody. Morning, members, stakeholders, volunteers, and welcome to the inaugural session of our Expert Speak series. Today we have Nichole Cirillo with us. She's the Executive Director of the International Association for Volunteer Efforts, IAVE. Today's presentation is the first of our 3 Expert Speak series. These interactive sessions will lead up to the 2021 Volunteer Conference on November the 30th, which is under the theme, Effective Collaboration as a Tool for National Development. So Nichole is the first speaker in these Expert Speak series, and she has extensive experience across environmental, social justice sectors, and it's only fitting that she provides some much needed insight during the course of her speak on collaborating through local and international volunteerism to drive action on COVID-19. So Nichole has extensive leadership, management, fundraising, and communications experience. She's worked with teams of staff and volunteers all across the globe. Importantly, Nichole herself has been a volunteer for much of her life, and building partnerships has been a common theme throughout her career. Nichole will give you a little more background on IAVE, but just to say it was founded in the 1970s and it exists to promote, strengthen, and celebrate volunteering in its many forms. There's a global network of NGOs, businesses, national volunteer centers, and grassroots leaders of volunteering members across 70 countries around the world. Just a little bit about the presentation. Nichole will make her presentation. She'll be accompanied by her PowerPoint. If anybody has any pressing questions, we might have to limit those during her presentation, but we will open the floor thereafter for a question and answer, an interactive session, and we ask that you raise your virtual hand and introduce yourself and your organization, and we can continue to collaborate after Nichole has finished the formal part of her presentation. So I'm looking forward to all of you joining us. Enjoy the presentation, and we'll close after. Thank you. Over to you, Nichole.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you so much for inviting me, for having me, and especially as the first speaker in this incredibly important series that you are having. I am in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in New England, where it is rainy and cold, and I hope that wherever you are joining me from, it's sunnier and warmer than it is here. So, Nancy, can you hear me? Is everything okay? Can you hear and see?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. I'm going to mute.
All right. Well, again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to this discussion and really to have a chance to unpack this very, very important issue of collaborating through local and international volunteerism to drive action on COVID-19. This is a topic we at IAVE are beginning to study. We've begun to study. I'll talk about some research, but we can expect that we're going to be learning lessons about this pandemic and volunteerism for many years to come. So I look forward to coming back and continuing this conversation on November 30th and beyond. So I will tell you just a bit about IAVE. I will also tell you about our important network for volunteering leadership. I'll tell you about some of this research and what happened to this network during COVID-19 and some of the implications for the future of volunteering. And then, of course, because I am returning on November 30th, some questions for you to consider now and between that time. And then, as Nancy has said, to certainly open it up to your questions and hopefully be able to provide some sort of perspective on those from my experience. So just a bit about IAVE. Our mission, as you can see there, is to create a more just and sustainable world by enabling leaders, organizations, and environments that power volunteers. We recently came out of our strategic plan, and as a result, we have sharpened our mission, not only around leadership for volunteering, but also around impact. We don't want to just enable leaders. That's really as important as that is. We also want to drive impact through volunteering. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And this, as Nancy said, we've got members and supporters and friends all over the world. We have three important parts to our work, and the first is advocacy. And by advocacy, we mean a couple of things. First of all, this global recognition of volunteering as vital to the creation of a just and sustainable world. We were able to work with the United Nations volunteers a number of years ago to really affirm the role of volunteering in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, them issuing that statement that the Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved without the support of the world's volunteers. That's really important as a recognition for volunteering and for the impact that it can have. But our advocacy also talks about equity and diversity and what we like to call a share of voice. It isn't just the perspective of those in the West or those in the North. It's all of our perspective about what it means to volunteer and the impact that volunteer has in the countries and of course globally. And this picture right here is a wonderful example from our global network member in Chile. The next pillar to our work is what we call knowledge development. We understand that as leaders, as practitioners of volunteering, you need information to help you do what you do better and more effectively. And IAVE is committed to generating that through research, through webinars, and through sharing that knowledge that we create. We also connect and convene people, and that has been a part of our work since we were founded in 1971. Bringing people together is a really important way to not only build our solidarity, to meet and to exchange information and ideas, but also to call out as a global voice the importance of volunteering. We have a couple of those things coming up, our convenings in December in Abu Dhabi. We have a global leadership summit, which is going to bring together for the first time ever this global network of volunteer leaders. I'm really delighted to say that CVSS Jamaica will be there and will be participating among that group of over 50 organizations. In 2022, we will be back in Abu Dhabi again for what will be our next World Volunteer Conference. We haven't had one since 2018. We have them every 2 years, but obviously the pandemic has prevented those from happening. So we will certainly be excited to host people in 2022. And then in 2023, a Global Volunteering for Youth Summit, which will be in Canada. If you go to our website at iave.org, you'll find information and resources about these events, and of course about all of the things that I'm speaking of today. Finally, the third part of our work is, again, that leadership development piece. And when I say the word leader, I mean you. If you're interested and passionate and devoted to volunteering, you are a leader in the space. And IAVE's mission is really centered on you and your ability to do what you do more effectively and to bring others to this cause and support of volunteering. And again, to affirm and grow this culture of volunteering, which, if I'm being honest, is not always appreciated for the value that it provides. IAVE really stands in solidarity with these leaders to lift that voice up and to also lift up the impact and the role volunteering plays. So I'm going to, just to say very briefly, we have two specific leadership groups. One is for corporations. As Nancy mentioned, we have over 50 global corporations for whom volunteering is not just a nice thing to do, it's not just what we say a tick box exercise, but something that they really believe in as a way to further their own values and their own corporate social responsibility. We also have this global network of volunteer leaders. And again, these folks are such an important part of this work. They are not the soup kitchens or the shelters within countries, but the organizations just like CVSS Jamaica that are really enabling and building those organizations in their country or region. So they're delivering and capacity development to those shelters, to those soup kitchens, to those volunteer involving organizations. And as we like to say, creating a catalytic volunteering within their country or region. They are so very important. Again, the United Nations volunteers declared that structures like these organizations are absolutely essential for effective volunteering. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. Why? Why do we need this? Why did IAVE decide to kick off this network for volunteering leadership? Well, again, if you take that statement from the United Nations volunteers about the importance of structures that create more effective and more catalytic volunteering, that's the emphasis behind why IAVE decided, after working with these organizations for more than 25 years, to bring them together as a network so that they can learn and share and grow together. From our experience, being in a network has a couple of really direct benefits. One, it really leads to cross-sectoral cooperation. In other words, it mobilizes volunteering to create relationships with government, with private sector, with other NGOs and civil society. But it also creates opportunities to expand and improve services together. Being part of a network raises an organizational identity. We saw that a lot in COVID-19, which I will speak about. But it really enables organizations to become the voice of that sector, to be a seat at that table when conversations about how to respond to things like pandemics are being held. Having that seat really does sort of amplify the voice of volunteering and allows the organizations to participate in the advocacy that enables volunteers to practice safely. Being a part of a network and a leadership structure also really pushes organizational learning, again, generating and sharing common issues and strategies and research. But finally, it really allows us to become centered on innovation, to be what we call these ideas factories that really breed collaboration and really focus on how to improve volunteering so that it's more responsive and more effective.
Excuse me, Ms. Cirillo. Mrs. Pinchas has her hand up.
Hi,
Please.
Nichole. I wondered if you wanted us to start your PowerPoint quickly. No, not yet?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's why yes, please. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, Shane, can you just pop it up, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, folks. I've been referring to my PowerPoint. I thought it had been up. So, yeah. Okay.
You want to share it or you want me to do it, Mrs. Cirillo? Sure.
So you should be able to see my PowerPoint. You should be able to see my PowerPoint right now. Is that true? Can you see it?
We do.
You're up.
Yeah, excellent.
Okay, apologies for that, but I will send Nancy this PowerPoint so that we all have it. But yes, as you can see, I've thought it was up. My mistake. Apologies. All right, next slide. So in terms of what the issue is here with volunteering leadership and why the need for a network is that these organizations often struggle. As important as they are in their communities, as important as they are in their countries for providing leadership and encouraging more people to volunteer more effectively, they also often struggle from government support that is inconsistent or policies, in fact, that are often damaging or not supportive of volunteering. Often businesses are not as supportive in terms of providing resources and funding to support volunteering. And often this notion of private philanthropy, organizations that donate, that allow these organizations to survive, are often not available. And finally, this notion that we have seen quite a bit during the pandemic of volunteer sending organizations, as valuable as they are, sometimes it can crowd out what is already there nationally and the leadership structures that are already there nationally. And sometimes that can complicate for those national structures what their ability to be seen as legitimate in their own country. So for all of these reasons, we decided that we needed this global network for volunteering leadership. And today we have almost 80 members, 64 countries and 6 regions, and we really focus on, as I say, that advocacy, that development, and that mobilization of volunteers. So I want to just talk a little bit about what we're finding about them. We launched this network just before COVID-19 in February of 2020. And again, we did it because we already believed in the power of this global network of volunteer leaders to really strengthen and learn and grow from one another. But we very much wanted to find out after the pandemic hit, how have national volunteering organizations across the world responded to the COVID-19 pandemic? And so we commissioned research that looked at over 137 of these countries and volunteering within this environment to see what were their challenges, what was the role they played, and what were they learning, most importantly, about the next disaster and how volunteering might play a stronger role within that. So I'm just going to touch on some highlights about this research and about what it says about volunteering globally and that cooperation globally that we hope to achieve in that network. So first of all, in order to meet the demands of the pandemic, and this is where you'll have to sort of remember back in March and April of 2020 and the confusion that really was around all of us, not only about the effects of the pandemic and the COVID-19 virus, but also about the duration of the lockdown or the duration of the pandemic and how long we would have to operate under conditions imposed. So in order to do that, we really found that these leadership for volunteering organizations, again, talked about their ability to increase collaboration as an important part of their survival and their success during the pandemic. We talked about the fact that partnership, they told us, partnership that drew on very complementary sets of skills was incredibly important. And that this trust-based relationship became a critical factor on the ground, again, for the survival of these organizations. And that this global network was really a strong part in helping them to form these cross-sector collaboration. And we see here that of the 70 volunteer leadership organizations that we surveyed specifically about that, 71% of them reported that they were part of these coalitions and that they really felt strengthened by them. And that these new coalitions really helped to support them in their mobilization of volunteers. That 64% of them had strengthened their partnerships with governments, which is really important, we'll see in just a bit. And that over half of them really were able to reach out to companies for support that they had never been able to reach out to before. Also in a COVID-19 context, advocacy became really, really important. And again, when you think back in those days, people didn't know what was safe. They didn't know what the risks were. Volunteers were at an incredible demand, but also many people felt like they didn't feel safe volunteering. But these leadership for volunteering groups were able to report that a really solid momentum around the important work of volunteers. And that hadn't been something that many people had felt before. Often they reported that volunteering felt taken for granted in their countries. People felt like it was always there. People will always be volunteers. And so it's really not something that is something we need to invest in or think very seriously about. But all of that changed during the pandemic. And these groups were able to really, for the first time, showcase the important work volunteers do. 44% of them, in fact, said that they were integral to vaccination campaigns in their country. That had never been the case before, and that they became what they called the go-to organizations in times of crisis, with 88% of them also saying that they were really working to create this enabling environment for volunteering to become a greater priority, not just now, but in the future. Advocating for inclusiveness, this surprised us a little bit. But this notion that highlighting the inequalities in the treatment of volunteers. So through the close connection of the barriers to volunteering that were being faced by the elderly or by other groups, it really highlighted for these national leadership organizations the issue of exclusion and who could and could not volunteer. These are ideas they never really had thought as deeply about, but because they were presented with these barriers, they really did take the opportunity to think and to ensure that laws did not discriminate against volunteers in private companies or public institutions, again, as a direct result of COVID-19. And also the inequalities in the treatment of local volunteers versus international volunteers. I mentioned that previously, but often feeling like local volunteers were overlooked by international larger organizations that sent volunteers to countries. But because of COVID-19 and the prevention of people from entering into many countries, these local volunteers for the first time were able to get the attention and that they deserved, both by their government, but as an important entity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. 70% of these organizations said that in the future, their mobilization strategies will be more inclusive. They will include significant outreach to the young, to the elderly, to people who cannot easily become mobile. But because of COVID-19, all of this became ever present and really the focus of volunteering. And 70% again say they will continue that as they rebuild back their volunteering programs. And also 41% said their organization has focused more on drawing volunteers directly from groups disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a really important figure about inclusivity and diversity that people felt they learned during the COVID-19 pandemic about volunteering. Also, this is a really important thing. These national leadership organizations felt they had to adapt and change so quickly, constantly in an ever-changing situation without a lot of information or knowledge. And so they reported back to us that their strategic abilities grew enormously. Their ability to think and pivot, as we like to say, during this chaotic situation, to think on their feet and respond, grew in significant ways. 87% of them said their programs changed to engage issues arising from COVID-19. In other words, they didn't just say, we're going to just close our eyes, close our ears, and wait for all of this to pass. They really dove in, they met the moment, they took on the challenges, and they responded to those challenges in extremely effective ways. 84% of them revised what they had to do to create online support or to devise ways of doing what they were doing, but in a socially distant atmosphere. 84% really sort of, again, met that moment and revised in the moment how they were going to continue doing the programs that they had been doing and to add new ones. 74% changed their leadership approach to respond more strategically. Again, that's such an important thing when we think about the human mind and how a lot of times change can be so difficult and people can sort of ignore it and run from it. But these people did not do that. And they reported that because of the demands for volunteering, but the other converse demand to keep volunteers safe, they really needed to become more strategic. They really needed to say, we're not just going to do what we've always done, but we have to think about how to do it better and more effectively. And 73%, again, said they were going to be much more dedicated to human rights, a respectful society, respectful relationships, and social change. Because remember, we hadn't only encountered a pandemic, we were also really grappling, first in the US, but then globally, with the idea of racial inequality and how that really impacts everything. People took that on within the context of the COVID-19, but also made this commitment to be much more inclusive, much more centered on human rights and respect and diverse systems so that they could achieve meaningful, equitable social change. So the pandemic had become this catalyst to revisit, let's face it, problems that were already there, but to be able that they perhaps got away with not looking at them. But in this age of the pandemic, they were forced to do so. And that these volunteer leadership organizations were able finally to confront conventional ideas about who can and cannot or should and should not volunteer. And they took that on with, I think it's fair to say, great courage. Okay, just a few more slides here. And this really talks about that the approaches to volunteer mobilization in the pandemic. 64% said they moved away from face-to-face volunteering into online. And to appreciate this, you'd have to understand that very few of them had online programs before 2020. Again, they had to not only recognize the need, but set up sometimes very complicated technical systems in order to be able to move their volunteering programs online. Online volunteering was seen as more accessible. People with all sorts of issues could volunteer because you didn't need to leave your house. You didn't need to worry about mobility or any other issues. You could feel safe inside your house. But it also exacerbated this notion of a digital divide. So this was a sort of 50-50. Everybody, and we'll get to this, people really embraced it. But again, in thinking about equity, in thinking about social justice, they also really understood that not everybody has access, consistent, continual access to technology that would enable them to do it. A greater emphasis was placed on volunteers from within their own communities. Again, in this context of having people come to your country and work, as good and valuable and meaningful as that is, you know, because that was disabled due to safeguarding, it really did focus on people who were already there and people who maybe had never really been engaged in volunteering, who suddenly, because the need arose, responded. And then finally, this notion of youth, really important. This notion of how youth can be used as volunteers. Traditionally, in many countries around the world, it was elderly people or people, say, over the age of 45 who tended to volunteer most. But because that particular group demographic was most susceptible to contagion from COVID-19, a lot of organizations took greater measures to safeguard the elderly population who had been traditional volunteers. But what that did was that opened a space for young people to join in. And we'll see in a second how that is something that is staying with these organizations. Okay, finally, we talk about the future and we asked this group, well, what does all this mean for you going forward? And I like this statement in the blue box. It's sort of a common sense statement, but it's worth repeating that what people told us is that change and unpredictability are going to be the hallmarks of the future, right? So in other words, we're not just going to go back to a situation where we pretty much can predict our year and what's going to happen and how to run our volunteer programs. Just the opposite, that they felt they were never going to return to those more simpler days, but that they were going to have to embrace change and unpredictability as part of their everyday work. Again, making them rely on that strategic ability, those partnerships, and their relationships to refashion and pivot in an uncertain future. Preparedness for future crises is at the forefront of their minds. So it's not just the pandemic. It's climate change. Again, it's continuing racial inequality. It's all sorts of issues that are likely to be exacerbated in the years to come. Yes, this is can be a little frightening, but what I like about this is that those things were going to happen likely anyway. And what we have now are people who are raising their hands and saying, yes, but we're going to be prepared this time. We're going to understand really and truly how volunteers can be at the forefront of helping to respond. And that really, COVID-19 is likely to restructure the volunteering landscape. What we talked about is this notion of digital for sure, but youth for sure, but also being more meaningfully involved in a government's response plan or in a corporate's idea of social responsibility. Because we all work so closely together, that's not going to recede. And this notion of really seeing volunteering as a more strategic element to civil society. Relationships and networks were hugely important, and people hoped and believed that they would continue to be so. And then finally, this notion of technology. Yes, it's really great, but it doesn't serve everyone. It will be part of what we do. We will embrace a technological future, but we will also understand that volunteering at heart has elements of humanity that can really only come out when we're together, sharing, working in solidarity. So for us, this meant this global network, bringing it back around. Those members who were members before the global network really used this network significantly during the pandemic to learn, to share, but also to really come together to create this global narrative about volunteering in communities around the world responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. 55% stated that the GNVL network really helped provide specific support in addressing these challenges, and that they really saw the benefits linked between their role in the network and how that really was able to help them grow their capacity through learning and sharing. So just a few questions for you to ponder as we think about what I've said, and also your own work as volunteers, as leaders, as people who are part of a planet that is going to need and require the 1 billion people who call themselves volunteers over the next coming decade and beyond. How did COVID-19 impact you as a volunteer? Are you a better leader? Are you a better volunteer because of what you know now? How important are volunteers in your community or your region? And are they a vital part of your national response strategy? What do we need to be doing as a society to strengthen the strategic use of volunteering? And how do we ensure volunteering is recognized for the valuable asset it is? Again, just a couple of questions to ponder as I think about returning in November and for the second part of this. So with that, I would be delighted to take your comments, your questions, anything you would like to talk about. I will turn it over right now to Nancy.
Thank you very much, Nichole. You've given us certainly a lot to think about, and it was very interesting to hear a completely different take on COVID. There were positive things. I agree with you. I think the pause alone gave us time to stop and think. The volunteering, the engaging with communities, I think it put us all as humans, as individuals in a society. I think we recognize and appreciate post-COVID the importance of community, the importance of working together. And one very interesting thing you pointed out was the fact that we'd never experienced anything on the scale of COVID before. We didn't anticipate how long it would be. We didn't understand the scale of it or its impact, not just physically in terms of the medical impact, but the economic impact that COVID has had and will continue to have on people. And you made the point that one thing you can be is that organizations need to be flexible. They need to be dynamic. They need to, the old ways are never going to be the right ways anymore. You constantly have to be pivoting and changing. So I just thought that, what we say in Jamaica, you use the word refashion and pivot, as we say in Jamaica, you really had to turn your hand, make fashion. So it's a very interesting take and perspective on COVID. We thank you. I think I want to turn over now to the floor. I see here that Paul Sully, I don't see any hands up right now, but Paul Sully has just requested that we give a little talk into the insights into any improvements about the technology for matching volunteers with volunteer jobs and opportunities. I think that sounds like it might be a very involved discussion, but I don't know if Nichole, you could just shed a little brief light on that area.
Well, I know that area, as I say, if there was a winner from COVID-19, it was technology. Both, in the way we order our groceries to the way we volunteer. And certainly we saw a dramatic increase in virtual volunteer platforms. And as Paul says, in the technology of matching volunteers and a burgeoning of that technology. So I think that that is not going to leave us. I feel like that technology has gotten sharper. There are different models of querying what you're interested in versus having people really specifically tailor and match what you are interested in, and to provide that platform not only in your own community, but globally now. So it used to be that most of that volunteer matching pre-COVID had to be in your own backyard, as they say. But now you can go onto those platforms and you can volunteer in Mozambique or in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter because those opportunities are available for you. And I think that has been a really good innovation. Again, we need to pay attention to the digital divide and the fact that not everyone is able to put their volunteer programs online in terms of that, and not everyone is engaging with that type of technology. So that will always be something we're going to have to grapple with. But certainly that has been a very, very important innovation this past 2 years, is that volunteer platforms that allow you to search globally now for volunteer activities.
Thank you, Nichole. Anybody else would like to share an observation? Even, we have a few members of the audience here who actually participated in the COVID-19 fund led by the PSOJ and CVSS and the United Way of Jamaica. Would anybody like to make a quick comment, share anything?
I'm not going to share about that. I'm Caroline Mafood with the Grace Kennedy Foundation. We have a volunteer program for our Grace Kennedy scholars, the students on our scholarship program. And prior to COVID, you know, they did things in person, that kind of thing. And coming out of what happened, having, you know, the in-person thing got cut, one of our students actually came up with a program called Ace with Grace. And they now offer tutoring services to students of our employees, or children of our employees, as well as students on a homework program that we have. And we track them through a Asana project management app. So we track all of their hours. We know exactly how much they're contributing. And it's been very, very successful. It's been great. So that's just one of the things where we've had to switch and come up with something new and different to be able to ensure that they are able to volunteer and maintain their hours. So I just wanted to share that as one option that has been done.
Thank you, Caroline. It sounds like a great collaboration. And as you know, further to what Nichole was saying, you really had to think on your feet, and the world just changed as of March the 8th or 9th, 2020, and we had to rethink how we did everything instead of just putting our hands up in the air and saying, oh, let's just wait. Mm-hmm. So that's a great program. Thank you.
And Caroline, will you continue that program?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Will you continue that program?
Oh, yes, absolutely, 100%. We're going to continue it. Without a doubt. We may give them the option to volunteer in person in other places, but that program will definitely continue. It's been very effective.
Yeah, that's what we're hearing, that people are continuing these programs. They've never, if you had asked them before COVID if they were going to set up a virtual volunteering, they would have said, no, we're not. We don't do that. But now we're hearing that these programs are going to continue, that they're not going to replace entirely in person, that will resume when it's safe, but that people will certainly keep virtual as a significant element of their volunteer programs.
Yeah, thank you. Paul has another question, and I think what I'm going to tell you what his question is, but he's recognizing the fact that governments all across the world, and in our particular experience in Jamaica, they recognized how important the last 18 months, the volunteer sector has proved to be intrinsic in any response to whether it's a pandemic or a national disaster. I'm seeing the formation of steering committees. They're recognizing very clearly they cannot do this alone. We are really the third sector, not an outside sector. So Paul's question is I think a lead up and a follow up to an opportunity that this presents. He's asking, will IAVE lead any policy modification proposals for governments to help empower national volunteering programs?
That is such a good question and such a great observation, Paul. Let me give you so the answer is yes, and yes. Let me give you some specific examples. So we were, one of the members of our global network for volunteer leaders is from Mozambique. And he's a great leader. He works very hard at his organization in Mozambique. But he's also not be able to be a part of a government response. Again, because Mozambique is one of those countries that receives a lot of volunteers and from all over. And he had never really been able to get the attention that he needed. But now he is. And so he is, IAVE is helping him to work with his Ministry of Youth to put together a structure for volunteering in Mozambique. And that's the type of work that we've been able to do with the recognition that volunteering is an essential part of our emergency response. So working with Mozambique and other countries to really help present that policy and platform within their own countries to be able to build that structure for volunteering. That's a small example, but it's an example we really hope to grow. The other thing IAVE is doing is we are reissuing our Universal Declaration on Volunteering in 2022. This document really speaks to the importance of volunteering now more than ever. And it's a call to action document that asks leaders and governments and the private sector to really understand and embrace volunteering for what it is, that essential part of civil society. So we are helping individually on individual country level, like Mozambique and others, to really help them build that infrastructure, but also on a global level to raise that narrative and that appreciation of volunteering. Just super quickly, I remember having a conversation, and I won't mention the foundation's name, but it's a foundation that we've all heard of. I had a conversation with them about utilizing volunteers as part of the vaccine distribution globally. And they didn't understand what I was talking about. And about 15 minutes into the conversation, they finally understood the importance of volunteers, in how volunteers could play an incredibly important role in overcoming vaccine hesitancy, in sort of rebutting some of the miscommunication that was going out, in actually helping organize volunteers on the ground for vaccination. All of the things that they could never do from their office in Washington, D.C. And this foundation said, we are embarrassed to admit we've never thought of volunteers in the rollout of the vaccine. And that's a problem, because we know how important volunteers can be. They're just not thought of that way yet. So our work, not just IAVE's, all of us on this call, is to continue to change that culture, to really make volunteers as part, an acknowledged and recognized part. So there's a long way to go, but that's all of our responsibility to do. IAVE will certainly do what it can, but we can't do it alone, nor should we do it alone. Everybody needs to raise our voice now while we have the attention to really put that call to our governments, our private sector, to make sure volunteering is recognized and respected and supported.
Yes, thank you very much, Nichole. I think the point is well taken. Timing is everything, and strike while the iron is hot, as we say in Jamaica. You know, the time is nigh. They recognize the importance. Eva Tomlinson of Longville Park Community Development Committee has just highlighted some of a similar type of interaction that her organization offers. So the Longville Community Development Committee it's based on volunteers within the Longville Park Housing Scheme, and they've coordinated bringing government agencies such as Administrator General to speak to people about simple things like how to write wills, etc. Ministry of Labor to speak on employment and people's rights, and the Clarendon Health Department to coordinate vaccination blitzes to residents. So, you know, she uses the word, we do the legwork of town criers. But again, we have a situation here where in the old days, communities were comprised of volunteers. They maybe didn't call themselves volunteers, but they were intrinsic part of a structure of communities, whether it was through your church or you were volunteering for councils. But here we have a sort of fall back to days of old where people volunteered because it was an intrinsic part of any community structure. Communities don't work without volunteers. Thank you, Eva, for that.
They do not. And let me just say, I often do this test on people. If I told you I was a physician, or if I told you I was an emergency health person, you would say, oh, that's great. Thank you for your service. But if I told you I was a volunteer, I don't think I would always get that response. And that's the narrative we have to change together. So that when you say you're a volunteer, people's immediate response is, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing we have to set as our vision together and work towards.
Yes, agreed. Any other comments, anybody? This was great. It was lovely to have everybody putting in their individual experiences. We're actually hoping that when we have 2 more sessions coming up. We have this session coming up on the 2nd of November with Dr. Pearl Jarrett. She's a serial volunteer. She resides in the UK of Jamaican background and a significant mobilizer of aid within the diaspora. So that's our next next presentation. After that, we have Rob Peer, who is also from the UK of Trinidadian heritage, and he's going to be giving a very enlightening presentation. Sorry, let me turn on my camera. All right, everybody. So thank you very much, Nichole. Was there any other comment anybody wanted to make before we closed? No? So hoping to see you all at the next session. Thank you so much, Nichole. I really enjoyed this, and you can be assured we will be further dialoguing, not towards your session coming up in November the 30th at the Volunteer Conference, but I think the CVSS has a lot to learn from interacting with IAVE, of which, by the way, CVSS is a member of the organization. Thank you, Nichole. So everybody, please feel free to communicate with us. If anybody would like a copy of the recording, a copy of Nichole's presentation, please reach out to us via email. Thank you all very much for coming. Looking forward to seeing you all at the next session and the Volunteer Conference on November the 30th.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nichole.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.